Welcome to our faculty colloquium. My name is Ron Hassner. I'm a political science professor and I co-direct the Berkeley Institute for Jewish Law and Israel Studies, which is the host of today's event. And I'm very honored to have two special guests with us today, and I'll introduce them one at a time. But before I do that, I would like to tell you a little about how we've planned the next hour and a half or so. We would like to start by having our speaker, Ayelet Harel-Shalev, introduce her research and her co-authored book. There will then be a brief response from our colleague Gil-li Vardi at Stanford University. And then we will open it up to questions. So you are welcome to bombard me with questions while Ayelet and Gil-li are speaking. Please type those questions into the chat box on the bottom and send them my way. We will then have about half an hour to select from those questions. And we will end well before 2 o'clock. So I hope that's clear. I'll repeat the instructions again in a short while. Before that, I'm delighted to introduce Ayelet Harel-Shalev. She's an associate professor at the Conflict Management and Resolution Program and at the Department of Politics and Government at Ben-Gurion University, Israel. She's the co-author with Shir Dafnat Koa of Breaking the Binaries in Security Studies, a gendered analysis of women in combat, that has just appeared and is the focus of our discussion today. She's also the author of The Challenge of Sustaining Democracy in Deeply Divided Societies, Citizenship, Rights, and Ethnic Conflicts in India and Israel, that came out in 2010. Responding to Ayelet Harel-Shalev is Gil-li Vardi, a military historian studying dynamics of doctrinal and operational change in military organizations. She's a visiting scholar at the Center for International Security and Cooperation at the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies at Stanford, a fellow at the Hoover Institution, and a lecturer at Stanford University. She's currently working on a book manuscript examining the evolution of German military thought in the interwar era, as well as research on Israel's doctrinal lessons from the War of Attrition. Please join me in welcoming both Professor Harel-Shalev and Dr. Vardi to our conversation. Ayelet, you have the microphone.
Okay, so thank you so much. I'm very, very excited to be here today. And thank you so much, Ron, for the kind introduction. And thank you both, Ron and Rebecca, for having me here in this distinguished virtual space during this difficult and unusual time of the pandemic. And also thank you to Gil-li for accepting to join this discussion. I'm looking forward to your feedback. And of course, thank you for all those who join us today from various locations around the globe. I will open with a short introduction about the intellectual background of my academic work and the book by Shir Dafnat Koa and myself. From the outset, feminist theory in security studies and international relations has challenged women's near complete absence from traditional IR theory and practice. And this absence is visible both in women's marginalization from decision-making and in the assumption that the reality of women's day-to-day life is not impacted by or important to international relations. Now, beyond this, feminist contributions to IR are also deconstructing gender. This means recognizing and then challenging assumptions about masculine and feminine gender roles that dictates what both women and men should do or can do in global and local politics and what counts as important in consideration of international relations. Now, one of the consequences of this scholarly academic stream is making women visible in IR and security studies. In parallel to evolving this intellectual academic stream in feminist IR and feminist security studies, the 1990s saw women beginning to fill a wider range of roles in the military, with bans of women serving in combat roles being gradually relaxed in some countries, a process that is still ongoing. As a result, women are able to fly combat aircraft, serve in artillery units, staff missiles emplacements, serve in submarines as combat medics, and so on, and fill various other roles that involve potential combat exposure and combat support roles. Yet today, about 3 decades after the start of these changes, most research on women involved in military life still concern itself to a large extent with wives of enlisted men, war widows, or women that were sexually assaulted in the military. The amount of research about women combatants is growing, but is still limited. It's thus obvious that women combatants who fulfill assignments in conflict zone or participate in various armed struggles deserve closer attention in the research arena. Now, within the larger debate on military conscription, the dominant gender images of war have been relatively fixed for centuries. Men are the militaries marching into battle, whereas women are the pacifists or the victims. And when women are involved in a battlefield, their contribution is typically underestimated and underdocumented. Not only the limited amount of study was triggering me and Shir and myself to explore this topic. A heated debate exists among scholars, including feminist scholars, regarding the meaning of women's participation in the military. In fact, women's struggle for equal participation in the military is often criticized. Many scholars hold the view that the struggle for equality in the military has destructive side effects, including the possibilities of reinforcing militarism, encouraging the militarization of women's life, or even bringing about legitimization of the use of force. Some people even claim that women should be, first of all, fighting for peace and for justice, and only later take care of equality in the military, if at all. And then yet again, decide for women what they should or shouldn't do. Additionally, some observers even claim that the integration of women into the military, and particularly into combat roles, has feminizing and weakening effects on military units. In Israel, some religious groups oppose the incorporation of women to combat units as well, adding more reservations to the discussion. On the other hand, other scholars think that women should integrate into the military in order to gain equality and equal status, as in other spheres in life, since military service is one of the distinctive symbols of full citizenship, especially in societies in which military service is mandatory. Just as the service of men in the military often translates into many formal and informal rights in the civilian life, so the exclusion of women from combat roles in the military in many countries is related to their diminished civic status. Yet, irrespective to the academic and ideological debate, since women are indeed currently serving in a variety of combat roles and combat support positions in many countries around the globe, my position is much to be learned from the phenomena about the gendered elements of military service and power relations, as well as about alternative interpretation of basic assumptions in the field of security and violence. In light of this context, the experience of Israeli women combatants drew our attention and sparked our curiosity. In our co-authored book, Shir, Dafnat Koa, and myself ask, why is it important to explore women in combat? What do their experiences teach us? What is the meaning of referring to soldiers and veterans, both as citizens and as violent state actors? When do women soldiers and veterans actively express their voices, and when do they silence them? How do women combatants experience combat trauma? What is the meaning of women's service as combat soldiers for the larger polity and society? We address these questions by exploring the stories and narratives of 100 women who served in combat roles in the IDF. In this talk, I will present short glimpse of our findings. So to emphasize the empirical context of the study, I will share one of the clearest examples about binary conceptions in the military, in the spheres of security studies and gender in particular. Several months after one of Israel's military operation, 53 Israel Defense Forces combatants and combat support soldiers were awarded military decorations for exhibiting extraordinary bravery. From a gendered perspective, the most noteworthy aspect of these awards was not the fact that only 4 of the recipients were women, but rather the difference between the justification for the awards given to men and those for the awards to women. Men soldiers were uniformly praised for actively performing acts of bravery, for protecting, and so on, but the women combatants were commended mainly for not panicking. One of the women soldiers who had reportedly spotted armed terrorists trying to infiltrate an Israeli kibbutz was praised for not panicking and immediately informing her commanders. Another woman soldier was said to have identified 13 terrorists emerging from a tunnel and similarly did not panic. Thus, with respect to gender, the language of the awards obviously reinforced existing norms. Praiseworthy men combat soldiers are those who show their strong and active nature through acts of bravery, while commendable women combat soldiers are those who overcome their weak and perhaps hysterical nature by not panicking. So this pattern is not unique to the Israeli case. It reflects the patriarchal norms that still prevail in military institutions worldwide. One might have expected that so many years after the entry of women into the battlefield as combatants, some of the gender norms informing militaries would have come under considerable strain. However, as we find in our research, women in the military still face a double battle, fulfilling the roles as combat soldiers, experiencing combat trauma on the one hand, and at the same time, they battle against the patriarchal and masculine nature of the military on the other. Now, the binary between hysterical women and brave men is not the only binary conception that exists in the research arena of conflict, violence, and the military. There are binary conceptions in the study of security, in the study of trauma, in the study of protection. It was these binary conceptions that led us to embark the current research while presenting the combatants as narrators while telling their own story about their military service. Now, I'd like to move to talk a little bit about the socio-political context of the book. This is provided by the Israeli Society. The Israeli Society perceives war and preparation for war as unavoidable processes. Military service for Israeli women became mandatory soon after the creation of the State of Israel. The women comprise 1/3 of the military personnel. Exemptions are given to ultra-Orthodox women and to Arab women. Plus, when a woman is getting married, she is no longer obligated to serve in mandatory service. She can continue to serve, but it's not mandatory. This rule does not apply to men. Now, in addition, while military service in Israel is compulsory for both women and men, women's service in combat roles is voluntary. Women have had to struggle for the right to join combat units, and combat service for women is considered more prestigious than traditional feminine administrative military roles. Women are still struggling these days to open more combat roles for women. Israel still lags behind other nations in this respect, and not all roles are open to women. In fact, women in combat roles remain the exception rather than the rule. In 2015, only 3% of women soldiers served in combat position, whereas today about 8% of the women in the military are serving in combat units, and the numbers are continuing to rise. Much more women are serving in combat support positions. Now, the book itself does not delve directly into the predicament of Israeli society or to the Israel-Palestinian conflict, the occupation, the Israel-Arab conflict per se, but rather focuses on the narration of the experiences of the women combatants, while these conflicts are always in the background of their experiences. In the book, we present their formative experiences during the military service and their perspectives in the military afterlives as civilians in a heavily militarized society. Now, to talk a little bit about the study itself, in terms of methodology and framework, the women including in the study have been drafted into the military at about the age of 18 and volunteered for combat and combat support roles. They all served as combatants for a number of years. At the time of the interviews, all have been released from the service, although some of them served in reserve forces. The interviewees served in various positions, and they all served in one of Israel fronts, borders, or checkpoints between Israel and Lebanon, Israel in Syria, Israel in the West Bank, or Israel in the Gaza Strip, or in war rooms located near the borders. All the interviewees have been exposed to various manifestations of the violent armed conflict between Israel and its neighbors. 50 of the interviewed veterans have served in direct combat roles, and the other 50 in combat support roles. Now today, I will discuss only a part of the book, but each chapter of the book focuses on one of the main topics that were dominant in the interviewee stories: violence and state violence, trauma and combat trauma, gender, voice and silence, femininity and masculinity, and more. Today, I will discuss a little bit combat trauma, the issue of gender, and the combatants' actions and struggles to integrate into the hierarchic masculine organization, as well as I'll share some aspects related to their transition back to civil life. So let's start with gender. Accounts of bodily experiences of women combatants disturb conventional IR and hegemonic masculine meta-narratives of war, whose tendency is either to abstract or to glorify combat, or both. Their narratives reveal combinations of feeling of competence and vulnerability, and shed light on women's struggle for gender integration into the military. Through the women's narratives, issues of body and sex gender are addressed, alongside a variety of ambivalent non-binary descriptions and interpretation of what it means to be feminine or masculine in the military and a military environment, and what it means to be a combatant. Now, feminist security studies and feminist IR offer an additional perspective on security. These theories hold that war and conflict should incorporate analysis of how people have experienced war in many different ways. As such, given the violence that usually accompanies armed conflict, these studies often center on the embodied person, that is, what happens to his or her body and how his or her body functions in war zone. These facets of war experiences were reflected in numerous ways in the narratives of the women soldiers who we interviewed, including, for example, the issue of gender equality, the centrality of the weapon and the military gear, and the persistent struggle of the women to integrate into the military system. During the interviews, the soldiers frequently emphasize their capabilities and their ability to act during warfare and their ability to protect others during combat. And I will share with you some of the narratives that we heard. Adina, a combat medic, shared with us her experiences of evacuating bodies of dead soldiers under fire in one of Israel's operations. In these situations, you disconnect yourself. Now, when I look back, I can see myself doing all these things as if I were outside my body. My role as a combat paramedic during my military service involved technical stuff. I had to lift the dead body, prop it up, and hold it until we reach the border. There is no one else that can do this. You need to get the corpses out now. Otherwise, imagine what would happen to the soldiers if they saw their friends burned. It's horrible. The goal was to get the bodies out as fast as we could, no matter with which car, no matter how. I did it for the soldiers. They shouldn't see their friends dead. So in addition to her emphasis on the doing and her need to disconnect in order to function under severe stress and to cope with danger and trauma, Adina's war narrative also sheds new light on the issue of protection. Sigal, a combatant officer, continues. We had alerts in the base about a terrorist invasion. My soldiers were a couple of meters away and kept calling me on the radio, screaming and yelling. They were on duty, but they were not combat soldiers. The soldier called me completely hysterical. Now, who's hysterical? Telling me that they were hiding under the table. It was completely surreal. So there I was, sirens all around, and I had no idea where the terrorist was going to come out from. I said, Shema Israel, opened the door with my weapon, and ran like there's no tomorrow from my room to the soldiers' room to protect them. It is interesting to see how the combat soldiers positioned themselves as opposed to other soldiers, eager to protect both combat soldiers and non-combat soldiers. In the interviews, we noted frequent references to the protective elements in the women's roles, including both instances in which they protected others and instances in which they resisted being protected by men. Now, I'd like to talk a little bit about the issue of protection, because protection is a central theme in security studies. Identities of men as protectors and women as protected afford women and men differing access to power and decision-making in the state. As constructed historically, the state's primary duty is the protection of the population from foreign threats, a task carried out by men through the rules of designated military service. Women have thus become second-class citizens. Nonetheless, they are expected to be loyal, obedient, and grateful to their protectors, and they are also expected to take on the role of the carriers. The narratives of the women soldiers interviewed in this book project clearly indicate that while they do indeed express care, they themselves view their actions as protection. Thus, the women soldiers themselves broke the care-protector binary. The act of protection was dominant in their narratives. It was dominant both among the combat soldiers and the combat support soldiers. I think I'll skip a little bit more because I want to have enough opportunity to talk a little bit about the body and femininity and masculinity. So continuing to the topic of the body of the female combatants, the women often reflected about what it means to be a woman in the military, what it means to be feminine in the military. Tal described with frustration the process that she went through. After the entire process of combat training, I became a man. As a combatant, I'm not a strong woman, but a kind of a weak man. Noah, for example, reflected on the complex nature of femininity and masculinity in the military as she understood it. She says, how can I be feminine here? If I look like a man, I behave like a man, and I crawl like a man, then am I a woman? I want to develop a different perception of what it means to be feminine. To be feminine doesn't necessarily mean to be gentle, to wear makeup. To be feminine for me is to be strong, to be protective, to be supportive of others. Maybe this is what feminine means, so I give it a different meaning. Now, Noah's view constructs in an interesting way with Tal's comment to the effect that in the army, she became a weak man rather than a strong woman. Tal's view echoes the theoretical debate about gender, which presumed that to act like a soldier is not to be womanly. The women soldiers who were interviewed grappled with the question of their gender identities as combatants. They displayed different and often ambivalent attitudes toward the question of how they ought to have behaved as women in the military and how they were perceived. Now, if I'd like to move a little bit further, another aspect of the women combatants' integration into combat roles related to how men in the same roles treated them. And they were often frustrated if they were not given the opportunity to prove themselves when joining the battle. Often they picked the men over them, and they were very, very much frustrated about this whole issue. Now, I would like to move to discuss a little bit the issue of trauma, gender, and war. To set up the framing of the project, I would just like to clarify that historically, research on human-induced trauma and its aftermath began with Freud in response to combat distress of men combatants. This research was later complemented by studies of the trauma of women and children as abused victims. Now, current knowledge about trauma, therefore, stems from studies on combat men and victim women. and combat trauma are still often treated in the empirical categories of men and women. Now, I'm not going to get into all the narratives or the traumatic narratives of the soldiers, but I would like just to clarify that our research discusses the importance of including the voices of soldiers and violent state actors in critical research about security and war. Critical studies often tend to avoid narrative research about such actors or to give them face and place. However, to understand violence, scholars should listen to and explore the narratives of those who are involved in committing violence. Moreover, our study moves beyond the gender dichotomy as well as beyond the hero narrative of war to explore narratives by the women soldiers and veterans that were out there making war. In parallel, we exposed narrative of potentially traumatic events that were not necessarily narratives of PTSD, because clearly war is a violent arena, and combat trauma was prevalent both among combat soldiers and among combat support soldiers. Jana, for example, an officer, shared with us accounts of several incidents she had witnessed. For example, she described that from the screens of the war rooms, she had seen a heavy vehicle with explosive being shot at and exploding, and 5 soldiers in her words, effectively evaporating. Now, witnessing these kind of incidents left her with a shock that the brain cannot comprehend. And we need to understand that women soldiers are also experiencing traumatic events in war zone, even if they're combat soldiers or combat support soldiers. And they are often exposed to these reality in the front line. Now, societies have long avoided listening to the stories about combat trauma, preferring to deal instead with heroes, numbers, laundered language, or statistics. And I think that truly listening to war stories can be devastating and carries with it the potential to undermine the national ethos and national morale. As Cynthia Enlow claims, the narratives of war and political violence told by the combatants often lie outside the mainstream hegemonic documentation of war and may provide a perspective that challenges common knowledge about security and armed conflict. Exposing these traumatic experiences, these costs of war, instead of silencing them, could ultimately affect the political elite attitudes and decision about pursuing violent solution to conflict. In addition, it could also expand the debate and shed new light on men's combat trauma and brings it straight to the discussion in the public discourse, along with reevaluating the concept of combat trauma in the context of the new war. Now, I would like to share with you a little bit some information about transition to civil life. Now, war and military service are acknowledged as enabling the young male to become a man. What then is war for the combat woman? Following this line of thought, one should ask, what can we say about the so-called reverse process of becoming a civilian again? What is the nature of this process for women veterans? Now, to understand the multiple ways in which women's militarized subjectivities are constructed, it is necessary to disaggregate the different groups of women in the military and to differentiate between women who have conscripted into mandatory military service and those who serve as professional militaries or in volunteer forces. Overall, to engage with experiences of war and political violence, we need to listen to veterans and what they're going through. And I think that one should not automatically equating the veterans with the military or the state, or automatically identifying them as either pacifists or militarists. Now, the narratives of combat women about the discharge from the military and subsequent transitioning into civilian life varied from interviewee to interviewee. A substantial number of the women veterans told us that they moved quite naturally, occasionally with some shock or minor shock, into their civilian life upon completing their mandatory service. The fact that majority of Israeli young adults, women and men alike, follow a similar path might serve as a supporting mechanism for these veterans. While the overwhelming majority of interviewees expressed the feeling that their military service have been a positive experience, some nuances of difficulties could have been read between the lines. Now, as the women combat soldiers who we interviewed repeatedly emphasized, when they re-entered civilian life, even for a weekend break from their military service, they struggle with patriarchal norms. Even though they carried with them their war experiences and they were well aware of their capabilities. For example, I will share with you a quote from Adina. She said, she recounted the following exchange with a father after she told him about her involvement in an operational activity very deep in an enemy territory. My dad told me, how did they let you do that? I don't believe they let my daughter do that. And I said to him, what do you mean let me? I chose to. He said he was very upset that I went into the battlefield into enemy territory during an operation. And I told him, what about my brother and my cousins? They also went to an enemy territory. My father replied, no, it's not the same. It's not the same. Adina was certain that she was the best candidate to do this dangerous job, but her father disregarded her abilities. Many combatants share that others were surprised or skeptical about their involvement in combat. We gain a different perspective from Susanna's reflection on her service. She said, I am a combatant. It is, in my view, proof that I can do anything in life. Since if I did this, is there anything I cannot do? Until today, I'm very proud of this. I wouldn't change it for the world. Now, to conclude, our research on the double battle faced by women combatants in conflict zone as soldiers and as women illustrates the complexities of their status. In their narrative, the women describe more challenges and struggle than what I covered here today. They discussed moral complexities of their service, and in particular, the challenge of serving in a military that controls a civilian population. They brought to us diverse voices and interpretation of their status. And into this complex situation, gendered elements entered. The women in combat roles reported having to face gender stereotypes and resistance from their male counterparts during their service. Now, integrating women into the military does indeed promote gender equality on the one hand, but at the same time, it involves militarization of women's life and situate them at the front line of making war and causing violence. Our multidisciplinary approach allows us to call into question widely accepted definition within our disciplines regarding, for example, who is a victim and who is a survivor, who should be termed as a combatant, and whose security is being guaranteed. Since military life is intertwined with civilian life in many ways, there is very often a lack of separation between the two. We hold that state actors, whether women or men, should not be regarded as a unified collective identified with the state, and all the more so in the case of veterans who hold a unique position wedged between society and the military. The entry of women into combat role challenges both the masculine hegemony of the military and the narratives of war in multiple ways, and forces the military to take a more complex view of the categories of gender and sex. Most of the women combatants were secure in the knowledge that their presence in the war zone and in combat roles have been important, and they repeatedly stressed that the roles in combat support soldiers and combatants were essential. In this talk, I had the opportunity to present a small piece of our findings. In the book itself, we elaborate much more about each theme, and our study opens a call for scholars to probe further into the meaning and interpretation of women's presence in today's battlefield. Thank you.
Thank you, Ayelet. That was wonderful, and very, very dense and very compact. You somehow managed to do it in half an hour, which is impressive. Gil-li, the microphone is yours. And
Thank you
please,
very
I'm
much.
sorry, please, while Gil-li is speaking, please send me any questions you might have into the chat below. I apologize, Gil-li, for cutting you off before you even started.
Well, I'll remember it forever. Thank you very much. I'd like to thank Ayelet and Shil for a fascinating book. It is, can you hear me? Okay. It is also a timely and important book. The experience of reading it was rewarding in many ways, some of them scholarly and some personal. I was a soldier and an officer in the IDF in a role mostly reserved to men. So I read voices that very much told my story and my experiences. And then I read the analysis of my voice and my experiences, and it was an eye-opening journey. I was also reminded, the book reminded me of what I love most about reading and writing history, distilling a detailed and clear picture out of an era using the voices of those who were a part of it. And I'm happy to learn that this practice reached IR studies because this is exactly what I found in this book. So I'm a military historian, and I read the book as such. I will refer to it not from a feminist studies theoretical or methodological perspective, nor as an IR scholar. As an historian, I'm acutely aware of and attuned to the specific as well as the general, the details as well as the overall picture, the unique dynamics and processes, but not so much the theory. I care a lot about, and I was looking for the context, the layered and complex identities and motivations characterizing soldiers of all ages, of all nationals, of all ethnic origins, and of genders. But most of all, as a student of war, I wanted to gain a fresh look on what Charles Moskos branded the postmodern army. And I found a treasure trove and an important key not only to the history of war, but also to the future of war. I'd like to start with a quote. We began to study. We studied the regulations of garrison service, of discipline, of camouflage in the field, of chemical protection. The girls all worked very hard. We learned to assemble and disassemble a sniper's gun with our eyes shut, to determine wind speed, the movement of the target, the distance to the target, to dig a foxhole, to crawl on our stomach. Everybody loved us and pitied us all the time. And we resented being pitied. Weren't we soldiers like everybody else? This is a quote from the Nobel Prize winner, Svetlana Alexievich, The Unwomanly Face of War, an oral history of women in World War II, published in 1985, translated into English in 2015. It tells the stories of a few of the millions of women combatants in the Red Army who fought and won the Second World War. Reading Breaking the Binary suggested so many similarities and parallels with The Unwomanly Face of War that I often found myself wondering about the many decades separating the experiences of women combatants. And Ayelet's comment about panicking women, right, reminded me a lot about, there is a very famous quote from Dayan after the Six-Day War, praising the girls in the communications room for not panicking, other than one who did. So the never-ending requirement and desire to achieve operational parity with men, the will to be accepted, to be heard, to be respected, the physical and emotional challenges, even the gear designed for men's bodies, it all sounded strikingly similar. Of course, the intensity of the total war cannot and should not be compared with what is essentially counterinsurgency operations. I will discuss this in some length later. Still, I found the similarities of women's stories telling, right? But what is it that they were saying? I start with the assumption that Israeli women combatants' voices are generalizable. That is, to a large extent, they represent the experiences of women in other armies, in other armed forces, which is exactly why this book is so important and so timely. Think of American women combatants in Afghanistan, where their role carry manifold political meanings and also facilitates literally all necessary engagement with local civilian populations. Same with women serving as translators in Iraq. Also think of Kurdish women fighting in Syria. I will offer other examples of a different kind shortly. For now, I think we can agree that in many armed forces engaged in active military operations, women can and will find themselves facing many of the challenges Israeli women serving as combatants in supportive roles do. So far, so good. What I was missing was the specific context. The IDF indeed is not fighting a conventional war. In the most intensive cases described in the book, women combatants took part in counterinsurgency, often involving civilians. In less intensive cases, they took part in military policing. Counterinsurgency is a unique variant of war, the dynamics and lessons of which are different in both nature and character from conventional war. For instance, traditional binaries against which the authors argue are notably missing in this kind of conflict. In insurgency and counterinsurgency operations, there is no war distinct from peace, no civilians distinct from warriors, no line separating legitimate and illegitimate targets. My argument is that it is very likely that the book's findings are not unique to women soldiers. I think they are common among soldiers of all genders fighting asymmetric wars on the counterinsurgent side. In this kind of warfare, because kinetic action is generally unexpected, limited, less lethal, and takes place in and among civilians, the challenges and doubts and the ways by which soldiers handle them are shared by those performing counterinsurgency. Indeed, population-facing operations generally yield expected results for soldiers. Questions regarding the morality of their actions, doubts, or conspicuous lack thereof of commitment to the cause and solidarity with comrades. In other words, men too are, and I quote, violent actors and also social actors. Perhaps the main difference in experience, if it exists, is not due to gender, but due to the character of the armed forces involved. Is it a professional one? Is it composed of conscripts? And the conflict the conflict, perhaps, in which they are involved? Is it an existential conflict? Is it perceived existential? Is it a low intensity conflict? It is. This might change soldiers' attitude and reactions very much. If you move away from the specific context of counterinsurgency and the specific challenges it prescribes, women combatants' experiences are not so removed from those of men. The very real effort to integrate and the toll it exacts on the body and the mind of women is real and has real-life implications which policymakers will have to face, if only for the sake of operational effectiveness. And yet here too, the requirement or self-imposed requirement to avoid, forget, or shape the body is an experience all genders share, albeit to a different extent, when they embark on military service. This raises the question of the uniqueness of women combatants' experiences in general. One might argue that all other bodies of different color, of different ethnicity, levels of political and individual autonomy, are all forced to go through similar processes and experiences upon becoming combatants. In the past, similar remolding experiences were shared by local colonial forces in service of occupying armies, as well as by mercenaries, prisoners, and slave soldiers. They're not unique in this sense, definitely not unique to women. If all soldiers are being remolded, some in more drastic ways and end results than others, I wondered about a specific outcome described in the book. Women combatants' thoughts were very much focused on the setting, the context, the action, and men around them. Very little is said about other women. And the one time they appeared, which, and you quoted, it was Segal's quote, they were mentioned in contempt. And almost nothing, of course, is mentioned about enemy women. Israeli women's identity as combatants apparently overruled other aspects of their identity and prescribed specific ways of seeing others and the other. This part of the process of becoming a combatant seemed flawless, it seemed smooth, it was almost too easy in itself, right? This is thought-provoking. Some parts of the process are friction-free, right? In other words, is shared culture overriding gender in constructing the experience of a combatant? A quick comparative analysis will also find it difficult to demonstrate that trauma and exhilaration, as well as experience, trauma and exhilaration as well, right, are experienced in different ways across genders. Trauma descriptions in the book invoke similar, often identical, experiences of soldiers of all genders in past wars, even in distant past wars. However, as Ayelet suggested in the book, we know very little about trauma and exhilaration in women, since research focused on men. Now with this book, we know more. And I'm looking forward to more research dedicated to women's combatants women combatants trauma. The National Center for PTSD of the U.S. Department of Veteran Affairs offers a painfully short webpage dedicated to traumatic stress in women veterans. So this is indeed very timely. That women's experience as counterinsurgency combatants is perhaps less unique or different than men's, or that maybe a little bit less different than theory might assume, is not bad news. It doesn't take away from the importance of this book and its contribution to our understanding of armed conflict. Indeed, what I found most useful in the book is its contribution to our understanding of wars of the future. We are witnessing both Charles Moskow's idea of the postmodern army as it unfolds, and of new technology's effect on warfare and therefore military service, as Ayelet mentioned in her closing chapter. A postmodern army is one which represents civilian society in all its colors. It is a small, professional, and smart army, distinctly feminine, even if not feminized, and an army in which brain force trumps muscle force, given technological capabilities that change both the battlefield and the physical capabilities required to survive it. Think of drone operations. A task that requires no physical strength is considered combative and offers a service experience which proved in various armed forces to be rather scarring. It is open to men and women alike. In some fronts, more killing is being done using drones than by any other means. As noted in Chapter 6, advanced military technology of drones and killer robots changes battlefield expectations and norms, and they are being reshaped as we speak. This book offers important insights into what such an army might look like. Of course, this process is still unfolding, and the change is still very much limited, but perhaps not for long. This book has a lot to offer in illuminating the future trajectory. English is a very difficult language. In illuminating the future trajectories of participants and practices of war, and hence the character of war. There may be more nuanced assumptions and self-understanding of combatants. There may be more questions asked and new answers given. I started with a historical quote, and I'll end with an historical perspective. At times of need, such as near total or total war, or even as we are experiencing now, an epidemiological crisis, right? Armies and state authorities find it much easier to recast bodies, as Ayelet refers to it, and reinterpret their roles. In times like these, we see new interpretations emerging with an active participation of women and men in granting new meaning to new roles. Ayelet and Gil, I thank you for your book and for the brilliant listening methods it offered, a method that facilitates in-depth understanding of layers of meanings, which are all too often kept hidden from scholars. I join your call to listen to the voices of those experiencing war, not in service of theory, but in service of better understanding of our time and zeitgeist, and hopefully our history, and perhaps even our future too.
Wonderful. Ayelet, do you want to unmute yourself and offer some answers to Gil-li's many, many questions?
Yes, I'm very, very excited, and thank you so much, Gil-li, for the brilliant reading of the book. I couldn't think of all the ideas that the book produces, and you did, so thank you so much. I think I would like to refer to 2 points that you mentioned. I'm not going to be able to refer to everything now. I'm also happy to announce that Shir and I just signed a contract to publish this in Hebrew, a different version in Hebrew, so we can incorporate some of the ideas already in the Hebrew version, which would be a bit different. I think that I'd mention a few issues. As scholars, we found ourselves confronted with a unique personal experiences that later constitute part of the rationale of writing this book. When we mentioned to fellow academics that we conduct research about Israeli women activists for peace or for gender equality, the response is typically one of enthusiasm and great interest. However, when indicating that we also research women combatants in the IDF, we were aware of discomfort, reluctance to engage of discourse, or even anger. And it is this dichotomy that led us to reflect on how scholars can be critical without being exclusionary. And we are well aware that Israeli women in combat were also violent actors. They were involved in violence. They didn't speak about that very much, but we still wanted to engage with them and to listen to them. And as scholars engage in narrative research, we are aware that narratives are profoundly political. They always mark and mask a political moment. So we should ask ourselves who deserve our attention, our ear, and our empathy, and who does not. By choosing to listen to a certain narrative and to disregard another is a political act. Critical scholars should therefore aim to expand knowledge about understudied and unexplored topics, including topics that are contested and considered a taboo as fighting against civilians. Now, I think it's very important that both Shir and I was very critical about this whole issue about should we engage in this. And we often ask ourselves also, are we being militarized? Are we listening to the combatant's narrative with honesty and curiosity? And we felt obligated to access this data. We felt obligated to access the data of women in combat because people are not listening to them. And I think it's important. And you know what, regarding your other claim about perhaps it's similar, the experience of women might be similar to men, it might be. It might be. But you know, everything is about men, about combat men, about soldier men. But no, this book is not about women as compared to men. This is about women in combat. That was the whole idea. We're starting the question from women. We want to understand women's experiences, and perhaps later we will conduct a comparative work that will compare it to men. But first of all, women are on the stage. It's the core of our research, and it was very, very important to both of us to make it as a starting point and not as an add-on on something like studying men and then just adding a woman as a footnote or something like that. So this is really, really interesting. About this whole issue about how the soldiers perceive themselves in terms of how they see the enemy. This is very interesting, and I didn't have much time to talk about this in this particular talk, but we managed to identify the often that they express themselves. When they talk about their actions, they usually said, I'm the best one for the job. I did the best that I can. I was the best combat medic in the entire army. But when they talked about moral dilemmas or about the enemy, they moved to speak in a different language. They used you, ata, like the masculine you. So they said, when you lift your head, you see that their lives are being ruined. You see that they're not, all of them are terrorists. So they kind of moved, they talked about the other side, but they did it in a non-direct manner. And we explained this in the book in the sense that we think that they worked so hard to gain their spot in the military, to gain the access to these roles. So they rather not to break the rules and not to start to question more questions about what it means and who is the enemy and so on and so forth. But we need to acknowledge the fact that these soldiers were not particularly militarist, and they didn't even use the word enemy. Almost maybe once or twice in all this 100 interviews. So it's really, really interesting to see how they perceive their own role and how they perceive the others. I think I'll stop with that and I'll continue the discussion with Gil-li together with Shir later on.
Excellent.
Okay.
Yeah, super. So I have a couple of questions and people are sending me questions. I guess one thing I'd want to hear a little more about, because it was a question that Gil-li asked, what do we know about women in combat in other militaries? And do you and Shir, do you have, and I'm happy for Shir to jump in, by the way, do you have any thoughts about whether the Israeli case is somehow unique, interesting, pushes boundaries?
Okay, so I'll refer to that. I think that there are several elements here. One element is the issue of conscription and mandatory conscription, that it's really unique. I mean, there are other nations that set some rules, but in practice, they are not forcing everyone to be drafted. So Israel is pretty much the only one, and North Korea perhaps, but that not asking the citizens if they want to or not. But so this is a very, very unique thing. But in terms of combat, Israel, as I said, it lags behind other nations, and Israel did not open all the roles for combat roles, not yet. I think that one difference that I can mention is when I compare the IDF to the US military, there's a huge, huge difference about the whole issue of sexual harassment and sexual assaults. In the US military, it's an epidemic. It's horrific. I mean, both Shir and I started a comparative study now with a scholar from Yale, and we interviewed both Israeli men and women and American men and women, veterans, and the experiences in the US military is horrific in terms of rates of not just sexual harassments and comments and remarks, but sexual assaults. The percentage is very, very high. Whether in Israel, there are frequent sexual harassment and comments, but first of all, we see that the combatants are trivializing them. They disregard them. They'll say, okay, you say this to me, I'll put you a bullet in your head. So this is the kind of, they see themselves as they are empowered and they can handle this. And about assaults, minimum of assaults. Now, it may be explained by a few, I can think of a few explanations. First of all is the character of the conscription. I mean, in the US military, people are deployed to 9 months and going away from home for a long period. They don't return every weekend to their families and their normal life. And also in the US, not all the society is being drafted, only specific social layers in society. Whereas in Israel, people are going to the military and then going back home for the weekend, and then they go to their normal standards, let's say. And also everyone is in the military, so we have like a different culture. So this is like one explanation that I think I should mention. Although I can always assume that someone has been experiencing a sexual assault and not telling us. But other than that, I think this is a major, major difference.
Great, thank you. And on behalf of the Berkeley Institute of Jewish Law and Israel Studies, I would like to thank Shir Dafnet Koa. I would like to thank Ayelet Harel-Shalev, and I would like to thank Gil-li Vardi from our rival institution on the other side of the bay. It was a wonderful conversation. I hope you all enjoyed it as much as I did. And I wish you a lovely afternoon.
Thank you so much. Thank you.